Episode 3, The Truth Revealed. The days following my confrontation with Sarah felt like a waking nightmare. The house that had once been a sanctuary was now filled with tension so thick it was suffocating. Every shared space, our kitchen, our living room, even our bed, seemed to hold the weight of her betrayal. Sarah tried her best to act normal, filling the silence with small talk and half-hearted attempts at conversation. But I couldn't meet her halfway. My responses were curt, my smiles forced. I was no longer the man she knew, and she was no longer the woman I thought I married. One morning, as I was sipping my coffee and pretending to read an article on my phone, Sarah walked into the kitchen. She hesitated in the doorway, clutching a manila envelope in her hands. "I want to show you something," she said, her voice trembling. I looked up at her, my expression guarded. "What is it?" She placed the envelope on the table and slid it toward me. "It's everything," she said. "Texts, emails, proof. I want to be honest with you, Jake. You deserve that much." I stared at the envelope, my stomach churning. "Why now?" I asked coldly. "Because I don't want any more lies between us," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "If there's even a chance that we can move forward, I need to come clean." I didn't respond. Instead, I picked up the envelope and opened it, pulling out the stack of papers inside. I didn't read every word. I couldn't. A glance was enough to confirm what I already knew: her betrayal was deeper than I'd imagined. The texts between her and Mike H. were flirty, intimate, and filled with plans for meetings I hadn't known about. The emails chronicled their relationship in painful detail, were longer and more detailed, chronicling the progression of their relationship. What started as friendly banter had quickly turned into something much deeper. They shared personal stories, even moments of vulnerability that I thought had been reserved for me, and casual mentions of the times they'd met outside of work. What struck me most was how ordinary it all seemed. These weren't the grand declarations of a torrid affair, they were the mundane exchanges of two people building a secret world together, one stolen moment at a time. By the time I finished reading, my hands were clenched with the pictures, and my vision was blurred with unshed tears. I looked up at Sarah, who was sitting across from me, her face pale and her eyes filled with regret. "How long?" I asked, my voice shaking. 6 months, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. 6 months, I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. 6 months of lying, sneaking around, and betraying me. "I'm sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I know I can't take it back." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You have a funny way of showing it, Sarah." That evening, I called Mike and told him everything. "She gave me the texts and emails," I said, pacing my living room. "I don't know if she's trying to come clean or if this is some kind of guilt-driven, but it doesn't change what she did." "What are you going to decline?" Mike asked. "I don't know," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. "Part of me wants to walk away and never look back, but another part of me, I feel like I owe it to myself to at least try to understand." "Understand what?" Mike asked. "Why?" I said simply. The next morning, I decided to take a step I had been avoiding. I called the private investigator who had gathered the initial evidence of Sarah's affair and asked him to dig deeper into Mike H. "I need to know who this guy really is," I told him. The investigator promised to look into it and said he'd get back to me within a few days. In the meantime, I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to Sarah and the mess we were in. 2 days later, the investigator called me with his findings. "You're not going to like this," he said. "Just tell me," I said, bracing myself. "He is Michael Harris. He's married, has 2 kids, and works as a consultant for the hospital where your wife works." I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. "He's married?" "Yeah," the investigator said, "and from what I found, his wife doesn't seem to know about the affair." I sat down heavily, my mind racing. Michael Harris wasn't just some random fling, he was a man with a family, a life, and just as much to lose as Sarah. "Thanks," I said, ending the call. 4 hours, I sat in silence, staring at the wall as I tried to process what I'd received. That night, as Sarah and I sat across from each other at the dinner table, I decided to confront her. "I investigate and find information Mike H. I know who Mike H. is," I said, breaking the silence. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. I said, my voice cold, "Michael Harris is married, has 2 kids, and works at the hospital. Did you know?" Sarah's face crumpled, and she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "You knew he was married." And you still, I trailed off, shaking my head in disbelief. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice breaking. It got out of control. Out of control? I repeated, my voice rising. It influences two families. Sarah, you didn't just betray me, you betrayed his wife, his kids. I know, she said, tears streaming down her face, and I hate myself for doing it. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity for her, but it was quickly overshadowed by the anger and betrayal that had consumed me since this nightmare began. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this, I said finally. I understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And for the first time since this all started, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before: acceptance. After my confrontation in her, the air between us grew colder and heavier. We barely spoke, each of us retreating to opposite ends of the house, while she sought solace in the bedroom. I found myself pacing the living room, unable to shake the revelation about Michael Harris. I couldn't stop thinking about his family, his wife, his kids. Did they suspect anything? Were they as clueless about his double life as I had been about Sarah's? The weight of it all bore down on me like an anchor. By midnight, I was still awake, sitting on the couch with my head in my hands. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. It was the private investigator. I found something else, he said without preamble. What is it? I asked, my heart sinking. Michael Harris's wife, her name is Laura. She runs a small business out of their home. I thought you might want to know, in case you want to reach out? He continued, but tread carefully. This could chaotic things up in ways you can't predict. I'll think about it, I said before hanging up. The idea of contacting Laura weighed heavily on me. Was it my place to tell her? Did she deserve to know? Or would I just be dragging her into the same pit of despair I was stuck in? The next morning, I woke to find Sarah already gone. Her note on the counter said she had an early shift at the hospital, but I didn't believe it. Every excuse she made now felt like another lie, another layer of her betrayal. I stared at the note for a long time before making a decision. I needed answers, not from Sarah, but from Laura. With a deep breath, I looked up her contact information. It didn't take long to find her small business's website, complete with a phone number and email address. My fingers hovered over my phone, my mind racing with questions. What would I say? How would she react? Finally, I dialed the number. Hello? A woman's voice answered after a few rings. Hi, is this Laura Harris? I asked, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. Yes, who's this? My name is Jake, I said, pausing to collect my thoughts. I know this is completely out of the blue, but I think we need to talk. It's about your husband, Michael. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she spoke again. What about him? I hesitated, then said, I think it's better if we meet in person. Are you available today? We agreed to meet at a small cafe downtown, far enough from both our homes to avoid drawing any unwanted attention. I arrived early, my palms slick with sweat as I rehearsed what I would say. Laura arrived a few minutes later. She was a petite woman with kind eyes and an air of quiet strength. As she approached my table, I could see the apprehension in her expression. You must be Jake, she said, her voice cautious but polite. Yes, I said, standing to shake her hand. Thank you for meeting me. She sat down, placing her hands flat on the table. So, what's this about? I took a deep breath. It's about Michael and my wife, Sarah. They've been having an affair. Her face froze, her eyes narrowing as she processed my words. What did you just say? They've been seeing each other for months, I said, my voice steady but soft. I found out recently and hired a private investigator to confirm it. I have proof, texts, emails, photos. I thought you deserved to know. For a moment, she said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she leaned back in her chair, letting out a shaky breath. I knew something was off, she said finally, her voice breaking. He's been distant for months, working late, taking calls in the middle of the night. I didn't want to believe it. I'm sorry, I said sincerely. I know how this feels. It's devastating. She nodded, her hands trembling as she reached for her bag. Can I watch proof? I handed her the folder I'd brought, watching as she flipped through the contents. Her face grew paler with each page, her breath hitching when she reached the photos. I can't believe this, she whispered, her voice filled with pain. How could he do this to us, to our kids? I wish I had an answer, I said quietly. She closed the folder and looked up at me, her eyes brimming with tears. I need to think, and I need to talk to Michael. Take your time, I said. If you need anything, here's my number. I handed her a piece of paper with my contact information. She took it with a small nod before standing to leave. Thank you, she said, her voice firm despite the tears streaking her face, for telling me. The drive home felt surreal. Part of me felt relief for doing the right thing, but another part of me wondered if I just unleashed more chaos into an already disastrous situation. When I got home, Sarah was waiting for me. She was sitting on the couch, her face pale and her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Where were you? She asked, her voice trembling. I met with Michael's wife, Laura, I said simply, watching as her eyes widened in shock. You told her? She deserved to know, I said coldly, just like I deserved to know about you and Michael. Sarah's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. Jake, you don't understand. No, I said sharply, cutting her off. You don't get to justify this anymore. You don't get to play the victim. She sobbed harder, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. I watched her for a long moment, my anger warring with the small flicker of pity I still felt. Then I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her alone with her guilt. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but wonder what Laura was doing. Was she confronting Michael, crying herself to sleep, trying to explain things to her kids? The questions haunted me, but one thought stood out above the rest. No matter how this played out, people among us have the right to know the truth. The morning after I told Sarah about meeting Laura, the house was eerily silent. Sarah hadn't left the bedroom all night. I'd heard her muffled sobs through the door as I lay awake on the couch downstairs, wondering if I'd made the right choice. By the time I got up and made coffee, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face pale and drawn. She didn't say anything as I walked in, just stared blankly at her untouched mug. Did you talk to him? I asked, breaking the silence. She flinched slightly as if my words had physically struck her. No, she said softly, I don't know what to say. Try the truth, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. Her head dropped, her hands clutching the edge of the table. Jake, don't, I interrupted. I'm not interested in excuses. Sarah, you've already said enough. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with tears. Do you think she'll leave him? The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I just stared at her, wondering how she could even care about that. Does it matter? I asked coldly. She deserves better than what either of you gave her. Sarah recoiled, her face crumpling as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I didn't stay to watch. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, needing to get as far away from her as possible. I spent most of the day at work, burying myself in tasks to distract from the chaos at home. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Laura, I confronted Michael. Can we talk? I stared at the message for a long moment, torn between curiosity and dread. Finally, I typed a reply. Me, where do you want to meet? An hour later, I was sitting in the same cafe where we'd first met, watching as Laura walked through the door. She looked different this time, her posture was straighter, her expression more composed, though her eyes betrayed the storm beneath the surface. Thanks for coming, she said, sitting down across from me. Of course, I said. How are you holding up? She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. I don't know. I feel like my whole life just exploded, and I'm the last one to figure it out. I nodded, understanding exactly how she felt. Did he admit to it? She sighed, running a hand through her hair. He didn't have a choice. I showed him the photos and the texts. At first, he tried to deny it, but eventually, he came clean. What did he say? He said it didn't mean anything, she said, her voice trembling, that it was a mistake, that he loves me and the kids. But how do I believe that? How do I trust anything he says after this? I didn't have an answer for her. Laura's hands tightened around her coffee cup. What about you? Are you going to try to work things out with Sarah? I said. She says she wants to fix things, but I don't know if I can. Every time I look at her, all I see are the lies. Laura nodded, her gaze distant. I keep asking myself what I missed. How could I not see it? It's not your fault, I said firmly. They made their choices. This isn't on you. She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine. It's not on you either. Jake, don't let her make you think it is. The conversation with Laura left me with more questions than answers. By the time I got home, it was dark, and the house was quiet. Sarah was sitting on the couch, her knees drawn to her chest, staring blankly at the TV. "You're going home late," she said softly as I walked in. "I needed time to think," I replied, setting my keys on the counter. She looked at me, her expression wary. "Did you meet with her again?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. Her face fell, and for a moment, I thought she might start crying again, but instead, she nodded. "What did she say?" "She confronted him," I said, sitting down across from her. "He admitted everything." Sarah's shoulders slumped, and she buried her face in her hands. "I never wanted this to happen," she said, her voice muffled. "You didn't want this to happen, but you made every choice that led us here," I said, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You didn't think about me, or Laura, or anyone else. You only thought about yourself." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. I leaned forward, my hands clasped tightly together. "Do you even understand what you've done? Do you get how many lives you've wrecked with your lies?" She looked up at me, her face pale and tear-streaked. "I understand, Jake. I understand more than you think." The next few days were a blur of tense silences and half-hearted attempts at conversation. Sarah tried to reach out, to talk about counseling or ways to rebuild our trust, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, my phone buzzed again. It was Laura. "Laura, I'm filing for divorce. I thought you should know." I stared at the message, a wave of conflicting emotions washing over me. Part of me admired her strength, her decisiveness, but another part of me felt the weight of her decision. It was a reminder that this wasn't just about Sarah and me anymore. It was about the ripple effects of their actions and the collateral damage left in their wake. I typed out a reply. "Me, yeah, if you need anything, let me know." Her response came almost immediately. "Laura, you too." That night, as I lay in bed, Sarah's voice broke the silence. "Jake," she said softly. I didn't respond. "Please," she continued, her voice trembling, "please tell me what I can do. I'll do anything. Just tell me how to fix this." I turned to look at her, my chest tight with a mix of anger, sadness, and exhaustion. "I don't know if this can be fixed, Sarah. I don't even know if I want to try." Her face crumpled, and she turned away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I stared at the ceiling, her words echoing in my mind. She wanted to fix things, but I couldn't see a path forward, not yet. As the hours ticked by, one thought kept repeating itself in my mind. Sometimes, love isn't enough to heal the wounds we inflict on each other. Episode 4, The Cost of Betrayal. The days following Laura's decision to file for divorce felt like navigating the aftermath of an earthquake. Everything around me was still standing, but cracks had formed in the foundation of everything I thought I knew. My life, my marriage, even my perception of myself, all of it felt unstable, as if it could collapse at any moment. Sarah spent most of her time in a strange limbo. She wasn't avoiding me outright, but she also wasn't making any meaningful effort to connect. I caught her staring at me a few times, her expression unreadable, and I wondered if she was waiting for me to make the next move. But I didn't. I couldn't. I was too consumed with my thoughts, too busy trying to make sense of the mess we were in. The betrayal was like a wound that never stops aching, no matter how much I wanted to ignore it. One morning, as I sat at the kitchen table staring blankly at my coffee, Sarah finally spoke. "I got a call from Michael," she said, her voice hesitant. I looked up at her, my jaw tightening, and he told me Laura filed for divorce. She continued, her hands twisting nervously. "He wanted to talk about what happens next." "What happens next for him or for you too?" I asked sharply. "For all of us," she said, her voice trembling. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Unbelievable. He's worried about what happens to him now that his wife knows. Did he even stop to think about what he's done to you? To me? To their kids?" Sarah flinched, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Stop saying that," I snapped. "It doesn't mean anything anymore." She didn't respond, just stared down at the table, her tears falling silently onto the wood. Later that day, I made an appointment with a lawyer. I'd been putting it off, unsure if I was ready to take that step, but I couldn't ignore the reality of our situation any longer. If there was even a chance that our marriage was beyond saving, I needed to know my options. The lawyer's office was a sterile, impersonal space that matched the weight of the conversation we were about to have. As I sat across from him, he asked me a series of questions about our assets, debts, and shared accounts. "Do you have any children?" he asked. "No," I said, my voice flat. He nodded, jotting something down in his notebook. "That simplifies things, at least. Do you have any shared property?" "The house," I said. "Any prenuptial agreements?" "No." He nodded again, then leaned back in his chair. "Jake, I'm going to be honest with you. Divorce is messy, even when it's amicable. And from what you've told me, this isn't going to be amicable." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. "You decided," he continued. "It's going to take time, and it's going to hurt, but we can make sure you're protected." I left his office feeling both relieved and hollow. The possibility of ending my marriage had never felt more real, and the thought of untangling our lives was overwhelming. That evening, Laura called. "Jake," she said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion, "Michael is contesting the divorce." My grip on the phone tightened. "On what grounds?" "He's claiming the affair wasn't serious," she said bitterly, "that it was just a moment of weakness and that I'm overreacting." I let out a frustrated sigh. "That's ridiculous. You have proof." "I know," she said, "but he's trying to protect his reputation. He's more worried about what people will think than about fixing what he caused." I clenched my jaw, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "I'm sorry you're going through this, Laura. You deserve better." "Thanks," she said softly. "How are you holding up?" I hesitated before answering. "I'm managing. I talked to a lawyer today, just to figure out my options." "It's overwhelming," I admitted, "but at least I feel like I have some control now." "That's good," she said. "Just take your time, Jake. Don't let anyone rush you into a decision you're not ready to make." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "You too." The next few days passed in a blur of silence and tense exchanges. Sarah tried a few times to talk to me about counseling or ways to rebuild our marriage, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. Every word felt hollow, every promise insincere. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, she approached me hesitantly. "I know you don't want to hear this," she began, her voice trembling, "but I've been talking to a therapist. She thinks we should try couples counseling." I didn't look at her. "Why now?" "Because I can't lose you," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I've already done so much damage, but I want to try. Please, Jake, just give me a chance." I set the dish I was holding down and turned to face her. "You want to try now, after everything?" "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us." I stared at her, my chest tight with a mix of anger, sadness, and exhaustion. "I don't know if I can do this, Sarah," I said finally. Her face crumpled, and she nodded, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed silently. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I thought about everything Laura had said. She was fighting for herself, for her future, refusing to let Michael's actions define her. Could I do the same? The thought lingered as the hours ticked by, and by the time the first rays of dawn crept through the window, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, the faint stirrings of hope. Hope that, no matter what happened, I could find a way forward even if that meant leaving Sarah behind. The day after Sarah's plea for counseling, I couldn't shake her words. "Just don't give up on us," she had said, her voice breaking under the weight of her guilt. They played in my mind like a broken record, but each time they replayed, I felt the same mix of anger and exhaustion. At work, I couldn't focus. The usual rhythm of emails, meetings, and deadlines blurred into the background as my thoughts kept circling back to my conversation with Sarah. I wanted to believe her, but the trust she had shattered wasn't something that could be easily rebuilt. By lunchtime, I couldn't sit at my desk any longer. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. I passed coffee shops filled with laughing patrons, couples holding hands, and coworkers exchanging stories. The sight of it all, normalcy, connection, trust, felt like a reminder of what I'd lost. That evening, I found myself at the gym. It wasn't a place I frequented often, but something about the idea of pushing my body to its limits appealed to me. Maybe it was the distraction, or maybe it was the need to channel my anger into something productive. As I pounded away on the treadmill, I replayed every conversation I'd had with Sarah since the affair came to light. Her apologies, her tears, her promises to do better, they all felt hollow. The rhythmic pounding of my feet on the belt matched the beat of my thoughts. What if I can't forgive her? What if this is the end? By the time I left the gym, my body was sore, but my mind was no clearer. When I got home, Sarah was waiting for me. She was sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression nervous. "Can we talk?" she asked as soon as I walked through the door. I hesitated, then nodded, setting my bag down and sitting in the armchair across from her. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice trembling. "I know you don't believe me when I say I want to fix this, but I don't know how to make you believe me." I stared at her, my jaw tight, maybe because every word you've said feels like another lie. Her face crumpled, tears welling up in her eyes. "Jake, I know I've affected the trust we had, but I don't know how to fix this without you. You want me to help you fix what you cause?" I asked, my voice cold. "I want us to fix it together," she said, her voice breaking. The next day, Laura called me. "I filed the paperwork," she said without preamble. I paused, the weight of her words settling over me. "How are you feeling?" "Relieved, I think," she said, "but also scared. I don't know what life looks like after this." "I get that," I said quietly. "Have you made any decisions?" she asked. "Not yet," I admitted. "Sarah wants to try counseling, but I don't know if I can." Laura was silent for a moment. "Do you want to try?" Her question caught me off guard. Did I want to try? Did I want to rebuild what we had? Or was I just clinging to the idea of our marriage because it was familiar? "I don't know," I said finally. "That's okay," Laura said gently. "Think carefully. You don't have to decide right now." Her words were comforting, but they didn't make the decision any easier. That evening, as I sat in the kitchen nursing a glass of whiskey, Sarah approached me hesitantly. "I talked to the therapist again today," she said, her voice soft. "She suggested we do a session together." She continued, "Just one, to see if it helps." I swirled in my glass, staring at the amber liquid. "And what if it doesn't?" "Then at least we tried," she said. "At least we can say we didn't give up without a fight." I sighed, setting the glass down. "Fine, one session." Her face lit up with hope, but I quickly tempered her reaction. "Don't think this means anything, Sarah. I'm not making any promises." "I understand," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you." The first counseling session was uncomfortable. The therapist, a calm and composed woman named Dr. Morgan, welcomed us into our office with a warm smile. The room was small but inviting, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs arranged in a semicircle. "Why don't we start with what brings you both here today?" she asked after we sat down. I glanced at Sarah, who was staring at her hands. When she didn't speak, I cleared my throat. "My wife had an affair," I said bluntly. "That's why we're here." Dr. Morgan nodded, her expression neutral. "And how has that made you feel, Jake?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Angry, betrayed, like everything I thought I knew about my marriage was a lie." She turned to Sarah. "And how about you, Sarah? What made you decide to come to counseling?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I don't want to lose Jake. I love him, and I know I've made terrible mistakes, but I want to do whatever it takes to make things right." The session continued with Dr. Morgan asking questions about our relationship, what it had been like before, how we communicated, and what we wanted moving forward. For the first time in weeks, I found myself talking openly about my feelings. I told Sarah how her betrayal had made me question everything, how it had stripped away the foundation of trust I'd thought was unshakable. Dr. Morgan had been gentle but firm, guiding us through questions that cut deep. What had changed? Where had the cracks started to form? The answers weren't easy to give or hear. By the end of the session, I was emotionally drained, but a small part of me felt lighter, as if I'd finally let go of a piece of the anger I'd been holding onto. That night, as we sat in the car outside the therapist's office, Sarah turned to me. "Thank you," she said softly. I didn't respond, staring straight ahead. "I know this doesn't change anything," she continued, "but I'm glad you came." I nodded, still not trusting myself to speak. As we drove home in silence, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the start of something new or just the final chapter of something that had already ended. The drive home from our first counseling session was shrouded in heavy silence. Sarah sat beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her usual nervous fidgeting was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. I kept my eyes on the road, my mind replaying the session. When we got home, I parked the car and turned off the engine. resting my hands on the steering wheel. "It's a start," I said finally, my voice flat. She nodded, a flicker of hope crossing her face, but I didn't look at her. I opened the door and stepped out, leaving her to follow me inside. Over the next few days, the tension in the house seemed to ease slightly. Sarah made a noticeable effort to respect my space, giving me time to process while still trying to engage in small ways. She cooked dinner, cleaned, and even left little notes on the counter wishing me a good day at work. At first, I ignored them, my anger still too raw, but one morning, as I grabbed my coffee, I saw a note that read, "No matter what happens, I'm grateful for the time we've shared. I love you." I stared at the words, my chest tightening. For all her faults, there was still a part of me that wanted to believe her. They wanted to believe we could salvage something from the wreckage. That evening, as we sat at the dinner table, Sarah cleared her throat. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Morgan said," she began cautiously. I looked up from my plate, waiting for her to continue. "She said we need to be honest about everything," she said, her voice trembling, and I realized there's more I need to tell you. My stomach sank. "More?" She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "When it started, I didn't stop it because I liked the attention. I felt invisible. Jake, you were so busy with work, and I didn't know how to tell you how lonely I was." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my voice steady so. "I didn't plan to," she said quickly. "It just happened, and then I was in so deep, I didn't know how to get out." Her words made my heart ache. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "I was scared," she admitted, "scared you'd see me differently, that you'd think I was weak or needy. And then, when things with Michael started, I felt like I couldn't stop." I pushed my chair back abruptly, the screech of the wood against the floor cutting through the silence. "You didn't stop because you didn't want to," I said coldly. "You had a choice, Sarah. Every single day, you had a choice, and you chose him." Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "I'm sorry." I stared at her for a long moment, my chest heaving with the weight of my emotions. Then I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing at the table. The following day, I received a call from Laura. "I thought you should know," she said, her voice steady but weary. "Michael is moving out." I was silent for a moment, processing her words. "Are you okay?" She said, "I'm fine, but it's bitter. I never wanted it to end like this, you know?" "Yeah," I said quietly, "I know." "What about you?" she asked. I hesitated, then said, "Complicated. She's trying, but I don't know if it's enough." "That's okay," Laura said gently. "It's okay to not know yet." Her words offered a small measure of comfort, but they didn't make the decision any easier. A week later, Sarah and I had our second counseling session. This time, Dr. Morgan asked us to share something positive about each other, something that had drawn us together in the first place. I struggled to answer at first, the bitterness and anger clouding my thoughts, but then I remembered the early days of our relationship, the way Sarah had believed in me when no one else did, the way she had supported me as I built my business from the ground up. She made me feel like I could do anything, I said finally. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of the woman I had fallen in love with. "And Jake," Dr. Morgan said, turning to Sarah, "what about him?" "He always made me feel safe," she said softly, "like no matter what happened, we'd figure it out together." Her words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment, the anger subsided, replaced by a deep sadness for what we'd lost. That night, as we sat in the living room, Sarah spoke again. "Jake," she said, her voice trembling, "do you think there's still a chance for us?" I looked at her, the woman I had loved and trusted for so many years, now a stranger in so many ways. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'm willing to keep trying for now." Her face crumpled, and she covered her mouth as a sob escaped. "Thank you," she whispered. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was the right decision, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were moving, if not forward, then at least away from the endless spiral of anger and pain. As the days passed, Sarah continued to work on herself, attending individual therapy and taking small steps to rebuild my trust. It wasn't easy, but the faintest glimmer of hope began to take root. I didn't know where we were headed, but I knew one thing: we were no longer standing still. Episode 5, A New Beginning. The morning light streamed through the blinds, soft and golden, but it did little to warm the cold space between Sarah and me. Our counseling sessions had opened up conversations we hadn't had in years, but they had also reopened wounds that hadn't yet begun to heal. Sarah was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, moving slowly as she prepared coffee. She glanced at me as I walked in, her face tentative, as if waiting for some sign of how I was feeling that day. "Morning," she said softly. "Morning," I replied, my voice flat. She poured me a cup and slid it across the counter. "I was thinking," she began hesitantly, "maybe we could have dinner together tonight, just the two of us." I hesitated, gripping the coffee mug tightly, but before I could say no, I saw the hope in her eyes, fragile and desperate. "Okay," I said finally. Her face lit up, and she nodded quickly. "I'll cook something special." Work was a welcome distraction that day. Emails, phone calls, meetings, all of it pulled me out of the emotional weight I carried at home. But even as I tried to focus, my thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah. I couldn't deny she was trying. Counseling, therapy, and even small gestures like leaving notes or planning dinners, but those things still do not calm my emotions. By the time I left the office, I felt drained, both emotionally and physically. I drove home slowly, taking the long way to give myself more time to prepare for the evening ahead. When I walked through the door, the smell of roasted chicken and fresh herbs greeted me. Sarah was in the kitchen, setting the table with care. She had even lit candles, their soft glow casting a warm light across the room. "Are you hungry?" she said with a small smile. "I am," I said, though the knot in my stomach suggested otherwise. We sat down to eat, the silence between us broken only by the clink of silverware. Sarah tried to make talk, asking about work, and sharing a story from her therapy session. Finally, she set down her fork and looked at me, her expression serious. "Jake, I know this isn't easy," she said, "and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know how much I appreciate that you're still here, that you're still trying." I set my fork down and leaned back in my chair, her words hitting me harder than I expected. "I'm trying because I don't know if I'm ready to walk away," I said honestly, "but that doesn't mean I've forgiven you." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand, and I'm willing to wait, for as long as it takes." The days that followed were filled with small moments of progress and setbacks. Some days, Sarah and I could talk without the weight of her betrayal looming over us. Other days, the anger would return, sharp and bitter, and I'd find myself pulling away again. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Sarah turned to me suddenly. "Jake," she said, her voice trembling, "do you still love me?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond but found that I didn't have an answer. Did I still love her, or was I holding on to the memory of who she used to be? "I don't know," I said finally. Her face crumpled, and she looked away, her shoulders shaking as she fought back tears. A week later, Laura called. "I just signed the final papers," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. She continued, "But also scared. Starting over isn't easy." "Yes, it's not," I agreed. She asked, "Have you made any decisions?" I admitted, "I'm still trying to figure out if there's anything left to salvage." "That's okay," Laura said gently. "Take your time, you don't have to rush this." Her words were a reminder that I wasn't alone in this, and for that, I was grateful. One night, as I lay awake in bed, I found myself thinking about the life I'd envisioned with Sarah, the trips we had planned, the dreams we had shared, the family we had once talked about building. Those dreams felt so distant now, so unattainable, but for the first time, I wondered if letting go of them completely was the only way to move forward. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. I couldn't keep living in limbo, holding on to something that might never be whole again. That evening, I sat Sarah down in the living room. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady. She looked at me nervously, her hands in her lap. "Okay." I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what happened, and about where we go from here." She nodded, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't interrupt. "I also don't know if I'm ready to give up completely," I continued. "So here's what I'm willing to do. We keep going to counseling. We keep trying, but if I feel like we're not making progress, if I feel like I can't move past this, then we let each other go." She nodded quickly, her voice breaking as she said, "Thank you, I'll do whatever it takes, Jake, I promise. As I sat in the quiet of the living room that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, hope, and fear. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, I felt like I had a direction, a path to follow. Whether or not that path led back to Sarah remained to be seen. The morning after I laid out my terms with Sarah, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in weeks. There was no resolution yet, but there was clarity, a sense of direction I hadn't felt in a long time. For better or worse, we were moving forward. Sarah was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked up as I entered, her expression cautious. We hello, grabbed a cup of coffee, and sat down at the table. She hesitated for a moment, then joined me, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug. She began hesitantly, "Could we take a walk after dinner tonight?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was ready for another heart-to-heart. Still, her effort was undeniable. "Okay," I said finally. Her face brightened slightly, and she nodded. Then, I went to work. I buried myself in tasks, trying to focus on anything other than the mess waiting for me at home. But my mind still remembers Sarah. She was trying harder than I'd expected. When I got home that evening, Sarah was waiting for me by the front door. She had already changed into jeans and a sweater, her expression hopeful but nervous. "Ready?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, setting my bag down and following her outside. The air was crisp, the fading light casting long shadows across the neighborhood. We walked in silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot. Finally, Sarah spoke. "I know I've said this before, but I'm sorry for everything." I didn't respond right away, my eyes fixed on the path ahead. I said eventually, "But sorry doesn't undo what happened." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want to make things right if you'll let me." I stopped walking and turned to face her, my chest tight with a mix of emotions. "It doesn't work that way we think." "I know," she said, her voice breaking, "but I have to try, because I can't imagine my life without you." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I wanted to believe her. Part of me still loved her, despite everything, but love wasn't enough to fix the damage she'd done. "We'll see," I said finally, starting to walk again. The next week was filled with small moments of progress and setbacks. We had another counseling session, during which Dr. Morgan asked us to write letters to each other, expressing what we wanted moving forward. I spent hours agonizing over my letter, trying to find the right words to convey my feelings. When I handed it to her during the session, she read it carefully, her hands trembling. Then she handed me her letter. When I read it, her words brought a lump to my throat, but they soothed the doubt lingering in my mind. A few days later, I received a message from Laura. "Laura, can we talk? Something happened." I called her immediately, worry gnawing at me. "Laura, what's going on?" I asked as soon as she picked up. "It's Michael," she said, her voice strained. "He's trying to contact me, saying he wants to talk about reconciliation." I clenched my jaw, anger flaring. "After everything he's done?" "Yeah," she said bitterly. "He says he made a mistake, that he wants to fix things for the kids' sake, but I don't believe him." "You shouldn't," I said firmly. "He's only thinking about himself. He doesn't care about what he's put you through." She sighed, the exhaustion in her voice evident. "I just don't know what to do, Jake. Part of me wants to tell him to go, but another part of me, I don't know." "Take your time," I said. "You don't owe him anything." "Thanks," she said softly. That evening, I told Sarah about my conversation with Laura. "She's dealing with her own version of this mess," I said as we sat on the couch. Sarah nodded, her expression pained. "I can't imagine how she feels. I've done enough damage to you, but she has kids to think about, too. She doesn't deserve any of this," I said quietly. Sarah said, her voice trembling, "I feel really guilty about what I did." I looked at her, my chest tightening, "But that doesn't make it go away." "I know," she said, tears streaming down her face, "but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you if that's what it takes." The following week, Dr. Morgan asked us to revisit the letters we'd written and reflect on what we'd learned since the session. "I've learned that rebuilding trust isn't just about words," Sarah said, her voice steady. "It's about actions. It's about showing Jake, every single day, that I'm committed to earning back what I cause." Her words were sincere, but I couldn't help wondering if they were enough. When it was my turn, I hesitated before speaking. I've learned that forgiveness isn't a straight line. Some days, I think we might have a chance. Other days, I feel like it's impossible. That's normal, Dr. Morgan said. Rebuilding trust is a process. It takes time, and it's okay to have doubts along the way. Her reassurance offered a small measure of comfort, but I still couldn't shake the uncertainty that hung over us. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I thought about what Dr. Morgan had said. Trust was a process, forgiveness was a journey, but the question I couldn't answer was whether Sarah and I were strong enough to make it to the end. For now, all I could do was keep trying and hope that it would be enough. The morning after our latest counseling session, I woke to a rare moment of quiet clarity. The house was still, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards as I moved through the kitchen. For the first time in weeks, the heaviness in my chest felt a little less suffocating. Sarah was still upstairs, probably getting ready for work, but her absence gave me a moment to think. Our progress, though slow, was undeniable. Counseling sessions with Dr. Morgan were forcing us to address truths we'd spent years avoiding. Later that morning, as I finished my second cup of coffee, Sarah appeared in the kitchen. She looked hesitant, her hands twisting nervously at her sides. "Jake, I've been thinking," she began, her voice quiet but steady. I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "I want to do something for us," she said, "something to start fresh. Maybe we could take a trip, just the two of us, somewhere quiet, where we can focus on each other." I stared at her, my mind racing. The idea of getting away sounded appealing, but I wasn't sure if we were ready for that. "Where would we go?" I asked finally. "I was thinking the cabin in Blue Ridge," she said, her eyes lighting up with a flicker of hope. "We haven't been there since everything happened." The cabin had always been a special place for us, a secluded retreat where we'd spent countless weekends hiking, reading, and simply enjoying each other's company. The thought of returning there stirred something deep within me. "I'll think about it," I said, not committing to anything yet. Her face fell slightly, but she nodded. "That's all I'm asking." My work that day was relentless. As I sat in back-to-back meetings and answered a flood of emails, my mind stayed mercifully focused on deadlines and deliverables rather than the mess at home. But as the day wound down, the thought of the cabin crept back into my mind. Could a change of scenery really help us? That evening, as we sat in the living room, I turned to Sarah. "Let's go it," I said, surprising even myself. She looked up, her eyes wide. "Really?" I nodded. "Yeah, maybe getting away is what we need." Her face lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Jake, I'll make all the arrangements." The drive to Blue Ridge a few days later was quiet but not tense. Sarah had packed carefully, filling the back seat with groceries and supplies for our weekend. I drove while she occasionally glanced over, her expression a mix of nervousness and hope. The cabin was just as I remembered it, nestled among towering pines, its wooden exterior weathered but sturdy. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. As we stepped inside, a wave of nostalgia hit me. The walls were lined with bookshelves and framed photos from past trips, happy memories that now felt like they belonged to a different life. "This place hasn't changed a bit," Sarah said softly, setting her bag down. "Yeah," I agreed, my voice distant. That evening, as we sat by the fireplace, Sarah handed me a glass of wine and settled into the chair across from me. "I've missed this," she said, gesturing to the warm glow of the fire and the quiet stillness of the cabin. I sipped, my thoughts heavy. "It feels different now," I said honestly. "I know," she said, her voice trembling, "but maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's a chance to rebuild." I stared into the fire, the flames dancing and flickering. As her words sank in, "Rebuilding isn't easy, Sarah," I said finally. "It's not just about moving forward. It's about undoing the damage." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know it's not easy, Jake, but I'm willing to try, even if it takes the rest of my life." Her sincerity was undeniable, but so was the pain that lingered between us. The next day, we went for a hike along one of the trails near the cabin. The crisp mountain air was invigorating, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. As we walked, Sarah reached for my hand. I hesitated for a moment before letting her take it. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded. "We got lost on this very trail." She laughed, a genuine sound that made something inside me stir. We were so stubborn, refusing to admit we needed a map, and we ended up wandering for hours, I added, a small smile tugging at my lips. The memory brought a warmth I hadn't felt in weeks, a reminder of the bond we'd shared before everything fell apart. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Sarah turned to me. "Jake," she said, her voice steady, "I know I've hurt you in ways I can never take back, and I know I've lost the right to ask for your trust, but every day, I wake up knowing that I'm lucky you're still here, and every day, I'm going to fight to be the person you deserve." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to believe her, to believe that her actions could match her promises. As we drove home the next day, the cabin retreat felt like a small but meaningful step forward. There were no breakthroughs, no dramatic resolutions, but there was a sense of possibility, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move past the pain. But even as I clung to that hope, I knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain. For now, though, I was willing to take it one step at a time.